as Margie said at the beginning, I'm going to give a broad overview of urban tree use, and then I'll introduce a clustering concept. I'm going to give 2 examples from Raleigh and Richmond, and then Dave is going to finish up with a specific project overview of what's happening in Cincinnati. And, I'm going to do this broad overview, and we truly generate a lot of urban tree removals every year. We have approximately 16 to 38 million green tons per year that's generated. And just to put this figure in perspective, this is on the lower end of this scale, 16 million green tons per year. This is an amount equal to the national forest harvest from the U.S. Forest Service every year. There are roughly 4 billion urban trees in the U.S., and this includes the trees we're probably familiar with, the ones in our cities, towns, urban areas. But if we look at counties, we probably have 70 billion urban trees. So you can use either the 4 billion, which is probably the ones you're more familiar with, or the 70 billion if you're looking at the metropolitan areas. We generate a lot of wood products every year in the U.S., from cutting boards to mass to artwork, tables and chairs and flooring, so forth. And I'm going to stop a second here and get caught up. A lot of the wood products, as I mentioned, were from cutting boards to biomass, artwork, as you see on the screen, to tables and chairs and flooring. And personally, I've witnessed a growing enthusiasm over the last 20 years for urban tree utilization. The growth has been slow, but it's surely going forward. And there are a number of activities that document this urban tree utilization. My former employer, the U.S. Forest Service, State and Private Forestry, and Cooperative Forestry have been real leaders in this. Entrepreneurs from around the country. I don't have them on the screen now, but I'm looking at different websites on a separate piece of paper. If you want to Google urban wood utilization or urban tree utilization, you'll find companies in Portland, Oregon, Minneapolis, in Connecticut, New York, all over the country. And these are just a couple of the sites that I found when I Googled them. I want to mention this, the last point there. There's a lot happening under the radar. It's important. This is true, I found, in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Richmond, Virginia. There's really a lot going on out there, but often we don't see that activity. And as far as these different activities, they're all good, but they are all individual activities. And if you want to look at another model or another way to determine how an area or a community is doing, you could look at the industry cluster model or economic cluster model. And here's you might call it a formal definition, but I want to highlight what's emphasized there in yellow, that this cluster model, we're really talking about groups of firms within a defined geographic region, and all these firms have links with one another, and they get a mutual benefit from one another, and that's very important. You might be asking, what is an example of a cluster? And I've listed a few of them on the screen. Ones that we're probably familiar with, like Silicon Valley and the computer industry, or Southern Michigan and automobiles. North Carolina, the Triangle Park area is a cluster of research organizations. And when we think of Hollywood, we think of movies. Those are examples of economic or industry clusters. A few years ago, we did a study, Dovetail did a study on economic clusters in the wood industry, and we found that there were a number around the country. If anybody's on from Ohio on this call, you'll probably recognize the Holmes County, Ohio Amish furniture cluster. in Ladysmith, Wisconsin, which is a small community in northern Wisconsin, they have a forest industry park. So that's kind of a general cluster, but the park was put together or set up to emphasize the forest industry. And some areas like Port Townsend, Washington, have a specific industry. In this case, it was wooden boats. So there's a lot of examples of wood clusters around the country if we think about it. And regardless of whether we're talking about automobiles or wood, these are the ingredients that we found in this past study for a successful cluster. And I'm not going to read them all to you, but those are the ones that we found were important key ingredients for the success of any cluster. And the important point is that you need all or most of these to have success. And as I said before, we found this true for autos, computers, various forest industries, and urban wood as well. So today I'm going to focus very briefly my comments on two of these key ingredients, the entrepreneurship and innovation and the leadership, commitment, and collaboration. And I'm going to focus on Raleigh, North Carolina, and Richmond, Virginia, just to give you a couple examples of economic clusters and some of the important points that we found from Raleigh and Richmond. I put Raleigh on the screen here, but this is also true for Richmond, Virginia. The entrepreneurship and innovation is key. And what we found is that a lot of the tree service firms or the private arborists were asking the question, what do we do with all these trees that we remove on an annual basis? You know, what do we do with them? In Raleigh, specifically, I'm going to give a couple of examples of the Everett Tree Service Company. They decided they would sell trees or logs to a log yard instead of taking them to a dump or a landfill like we show on the screen here. So their solution to the question, what do we do with all these trees we remove, they had a market for their logs. They had a nearby log yard, so they sold the logs. Another entrepreneur in the same area, Dunn Tree Service, he also removed trees, but he also had a portable mill, which he manufactured lumber. And instead of selling trees or logs, lumber was what he sold. So that was another economic opportunity for him to sell lumber instead of trees. The third entrepreneur, Roy Lynch, he actually brought his mill right to a homeowner's driveway and sawed trees that were being removed by a private arborist. So we had one issue and three solutions. Basically, you know, what do we do with all these trees we're removing? That was the issue, and here we have three solutions. My point with all of this is to mention to people, to remind them that we really need to guide people and don't necessarily need to tell them what to do. You know, if we have an overabundance of trees, if we provide them with the resources to begin a business, then these people, in many cases, they can figure out what to do with the trees. Some sell them, some sell lumber, and the last model here, Roy Lynch, he actually brought a portable mill right to the homeowner's house. So entrepreneurship and innovation are definitely key, and it's one of the key ingredients of this cluster concept. The second key ingredient that I'm going to mention is leadership, commitment, and collaboration. And we found this true, again, in Raleigh, Richmond, which I'm going to emphasize today, but we also found it true in other communities across the country. When I talked to people that were removing trees, I heard various comments like, well, lack of space to store or drop the trees at our business. We don't have the time to do it. There's logistic problems with transportation and so forth. We only remove a small quantity of trees. You know, who would want them? Where do we take these tree takedowns? And a tree service firm, if there are folks on the line that remove trees on a regular basis, you know your job is to quickly, safely, and quickly remove the tree waste from the site, and that's your primary objective. Well, one of the recommendations that we had for both Raleigh and Richmond were to develop more log yards, places to dump trees, not necessarily to sell them, but just to a place where a tree service firm could put the trees. And I want to get back to this cluster model, and this is all tied in to the leadership commitment and collaboration. We truly need a leader who is committed and willing to collaborate. And I bring this out because we need somebody to bring people together, because a lot of people have different agendas, different viewpoints. For example, we need to know all the issues, for example, and the issue here was what I had described about, you know, what do we do with these trees? We have lack of space, lack of time, small quantities, etc. So the recommendation for both Raleigh and Richmond was to find a leader. And this leader might be an organization. It doesn't have to be a specific person. It could be an organization. It could be a community. It could be the cities of Raleigh, in my specific case that I'm working with them, or it could be Richmond. So I want to emphasize it's very important as far as a recommendation to look at the key ingredients of this cluster model and evaluate your particular situation. You know, what's missing, what needs to be enhanced, where you need help, etc. Because all communities are different, and they're going to have different needs, and some of these key ingredients may already be in place, and the cluster model can help you decide what's in place and what needs, you know, reinforced, so to speak. So use the cluster model and encourage these entrepreneurs and innovators. And as I said before, the objective here is to guide them and don't tell them what to do. Because if they truly are entrepreneurs and innovators, they're going to figure it out. But they need the resources to help us. Okay. The leadership commitment and collaboration it's not necessarily, doesn't have to be a traditional forest products person. You know, in my past experience, I was thinking, well, we need somebody that has a forest products background in order to lead this cluster, but that's not necessarily true. It could be a city or a community. It could be somebody that just says, we're not going to take our trees to the dump anymore, and they really have this passion to get things done. The next slide, the recommendation is to keep in mind that all cluster ingredients won't happen at once. And this is something that may take many years for this to occur as far as a successful cluster. But the key thing is just to remember they won't all happen at once. And the next slide, when I talk about, it isn't a formal cluster strategy, but we found it true in Raleigh and Richmond and other cities where I've worked that a strong progressive urban forestry program can serve as a foundation for wood utilization activities in a community. So that's a starting point. It's not necessarily a cluster function or a cluster strategy, but it's something that I've found true in my work across the country. So the next slide is the bottom line, and it talked about you might want to look at the industry or business cluster model as a research-based approach for starting or expanding an urban tree utilization program. It doesn't look at just one individual activity. It kind of looks at the entire activities that need to be in place for a successful outcome. Raleigh and Richmond demonstrate how key ingredients can build upon one another to create an emerging and successful cluster. And if anybody has specific questions on that, I can talk about that in the Q&A. The last slide I'll show is for additional information where I have my name and the website of Dovetail Partners. And I wanted to mention that there are various reports on the Dovetail website relating to clustering and urban tree utilization. So these are available for free. If anybody would like to tap into them, you can go to our website and just look for clustering and urban tree utilization, and there should be some reports that you can download for free there. And with that, I'm going to stop and turn it back to our moderator, Margie or Amelia.